A cold Seattle drizzle crept beneath Jacob Miller's worn coat. As the eviction deadline hung over him like a falling blade, he held his 4-year-old granddaughter Emily close the last of his crumpled bills buried deep in his pocket when the auctioneer rolled up the door to Unit B27. The crowd recoiled, a sour wave of mildew and rotting cardboard spilling into the air. Seasoned buyers laughed and moved on, but Jacob didn't coda. His 7-year-old German Shepherd stood frozen, nose fixed on a single strip of olive green canvas, half buried in the shadows, as if only he could sense what others overlooked. Jacob lifted his hand, heart pounding. Why would a man with nothing left gamble everything on a pile of ruined trash? And what forgotten truth from a fallen general was waiting beneath that decay? Stay with us. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. A cold autumn wind swept across Elliott Bay, carrying the sharp scent of steel and seawater along the rust-stained cranes towering over Seattle's harbor. Jacob Miller, 67 and worn down by years that had carved deep lines into his weathered face, tightened his grip around the small bundle in his arms, his granddaughter Emily. The girl was 4, slight and pale as early frost, with soft brown curls that trembled each time the wind cut across the pier. Her fingers clutched the collar of Jacob's old denim jacket, as if it were the last warm thing in the world. Jacob had once been a Marine, broad-shouldered, disciplined, a man who could once sprint through sandstorms without losing breath. Now he limped through the world with the slow, uneven step of someone whose past battles remained lodged in his bones. His right knee had been shattered by a collapsing wall during a humanitarian mission decades ago, and since then every cold season felt like punishment he hadn't quite earned. Beneath him, standing alert and silent, was Coda, a 7-year-old German Shepherd with sable and black fur thick enough to break the harshest wind. His body was muscular without being bulky, with the proud, noble stance of a guardian who understood exactly whom he lived to protect. Coda observed the world through sharp, almond-shaped eyes, always calculating, always sensing threats before anyone else. The long scar running under his left ear, remnant of his abandoned life as an untrained guard dog, gave him a rugged, almost soldier-like dignity. The three of them waited at Pier 46 for a bus that always ran late when the weather changed. Around them, longshoremen in heavy coats shouted orders as they hauled cargo, but none spared more than a quick, sympathetic glance at the grandfather huddled beneath a broken street lamp. Life at the docks didn't pause for hardship. A freight ship sounded its horn, deep, metallic, startling, and Emily jerked violently, crying out as she buried her face into Jacob's chest. Without a sound, Coda stepped closer and rested his head gently against her leg, letting his warmth seep into her trembling body. It was his first language, comfort through presence. "It's all right, sweetheart," Jacob murmured, though his voice was hollow with exhaustion. He bent to pick up the eviction notice the wind had just ripped from his pocket. The paper skittered across the pavement like a wounded bird, and when he reached for it, the gust nearly knocked him sideways. Coda moved instantly, positioning himself between Emily and the wind, shielding her with the calm precision of a soldier taking a post. The notice glared back at Jacob with its red lettering, "Final termination, $1,600 due, 4 days remaining." His jaw tightened. His hands, scarred, broad, once steady, now trembled not from age but from a fear he had spent decades pretending he could no longer feel. Fear of failing someone he loved, fear of promises he might not keep. Emily sniffled quietly, unaware of the weight crushing him. She knew only that Grandpa's arms felt safe. Jacob forced a breath into lungs that suddenly seemed too small. "We'll figure it out," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he was talking to Emily, Coda, or the cold gray sky. The bus still hadn't come. A gull screeched overhead, circling low as if watching a story unfold. As they waited, Coda lifted his head sharply. His nose twitched, pointing east, toward a row of derelict storage warehouses near the old industrial district. He stared so intently that Jacob followed his gaze. "What is it, boy?" Jacob asked, but Koda didn't blink. A dog's instincts were mysterious but rarely wrong, and Koda's instincts had saved them from danger before. From an unstable neighbor with too much whiskey in his blood, from a runaway truck that rolled backward on a hill. He had a gift for sensing change, for knowing when fate was about to shift its weight. Jacob tightened his tired grip on Emily and finally boarded the late bus when it arrived. The heater inside sputtered weak warmth, and the windows fogged instantly. Koda curled protectively against Emily's feet as she drifted to sleep, her cheeks still streaked with dried tears. Jacob's thoughts drifted, not to memories of war, but to the slow, grinding war of poverty, of being old in a world that rewarded the young, of carrying a child's future on shoulders already collapsing under age and regret. When they reached his small rented duplex, Jacob opened the mailbox, already knowing what he would find. Bills, more warnings, and the same crushing silence where help should have been. Inside, as Emily drew with broken crayons at the wobbling kitchen table, Jacob unfolded the eviction notice again. The numbers stared back at him, each digit a stone dragging him deeper underwater. He opened the Seattle Daily Chronicle, hoping for work, hope, anything. His eyes skimmed over pointless ads until they caught on something, small, tucked between car sales and lost pet notices. Fremont Storage Auction, cash only. Saturday, 9:00 a.m. Something in his chest shifted, a small, irrational spark. Then he felt Koda's gaze on him. The dog stood near the door, tail still, eyes focused, as if he recognized that this scrap of newsprint had meaning. Jacob looked from the ad to Koda's steady, unwavering stare. "You think this is something, boy?" he whispered. Koda didn't blink, and sometimes Jacob had learned fate arrived not as a miracle, but as a dog who simply refused to look away. And so, with exhaustion hanging heavy but a faint thread of stubborn hope rising in his chest, Jacob decided he would go to that auction, even if it was foolish, even if it was desperate, even if it was their last chance. The drizzle had thinned into a pale silver mist by the time Jacob reached Fremont Storage, his boots leaving dark prints across the damp asphalt as he carried Emily wrapped in her worn purple blanket. Koda trotted at his side, his paws silent, his fur beating with moisture, but his posture steady and alert. Jacob's breath formed faint clouds in the cold morning air, mingling with the steam rising from the coffee cups of the bidders gathered under the metal awning. They were men and women hardened by the business of storage hunting, broad-shouldered, quick-eyed, experienced in spotting value through the smallest crack of a door. Most ignored Jacob entirely. A few stared at his threadbare coat, the bent shape of his tired frame, or the tiny child sleeping against his shoulder. One man, a tall figure with a soot-black beard and a yellow rain slicker, chuckled openly. His name, caught from the shout of a companion, was Richie Nolan, a local hustler known for flipping stolen radiator parts behind pawn shops. Richie had a narrow face with sharp cheekbones and a missing front tooth that flashed when he laughed. He looked at Jacob as one looks at a man about to make a fool of himself. "Came to buy hope, old-timer," he called, his voice grating with mockery. Jacob didn't answer. He rarely had the strength for men like Richie. Koda, however, fixed Richie with a long, unblinking stare that made the man shift his weight uneasily. The auctioneer, a stout woman in her mid-50s named Linda Carver, emerged from the office at 9 sharp. She had a square jaw, graying braid, and a pragmatic look in her eyes, the look of someone who had balanced single motherhood, debt, and work for most of her life. Her voice was no nonsense but not unkind. "Unit B27, she announced, jangling a ring of keys. "Cash only, no touching until it's yours." She nodded toward Jacob when their gazes met. She didn't smile, but there was something soft, almost respectful, in the way she noted Emily and Koda. Linda had been raised by her grandfather. She recognized the shape of sacrifice when she saw it. The group moved toward the row of metal doors, footsteps echoing through the corridor. Rain pinged lightly against the sheet metal roofs. Kota walked closer to Jacob now, his shoulders lowering into a steady, determined gait. Something in the air had changed for him. His scenting grew sharper, more focused. When Linda slid the lock off B-27 and rolled the door upward, a wave of damp, stale rot rolled out. Several bidders grimaced and backed away immediately. Black garbage bags sagged against one another like bruised fruit. Cardboard boxes had collapsed into mushy heaps. A bicycle frame bent in half leaned against a broken dresser. "Pass," someone muttered. "Turd. Nothing but dump fees," another said. But Jacob felt Kota step forward. He followed the dog's movement with growing unease. Kota lowered his head near the left corner, sniffing deeply. His tail went stiff, his ears angling forward. Then, with surgical precision, he raised one paw and tapped a small, half-buried object beneath a ripped trash bag. Jacob frowned, leaned slightly, and saw it. A flicker of olive-green canvas, military issue, and not just tossed aside, but placed, covered deliberately, hidden. Kota turned to Jacob, amber eyes firm, almost speaking. "This one." Linda began the bid at $50. Silence met her. She tried 25. Nothing. Richie scoffed, already turning away. Jacob swallowed hard, tightening his hold on Emily as she stirred. 210, he said quietly, almost ashamed of the smallness of his voice. Linda blinked in surprise. 210 from the gentleman in the back. Any other bidders? Richie opened his mouth, but Kota took a single step toward him, lips just barely parting, not a growl, but the promise of one. Richie closed his mouth again. "Sold," Linda declared. Jacob exhaled shakily. That was nearly everything he had. When the group dispersed, he set Emily down on a folded tarp Linda lent him. "For the girl, no charge." Jacob thanked her softly. Emily sat cross-legged, rubbing her eyes, while Kota remained beside her like a silent watchtower. Jacob pulled on his gloves and began clearing the path toward the canvas object. Most of the bags were filled with ruined clothes or soggy magazines. The smell was almost unbearable, but Kota was patient, tracking Jacob's progress, nudging aside debris with his nose when needed. At last, Jacob crouched before the green canvas bundle. It was a military duffel, heavier than he expected. The knot securing it was an older tactical style, firm, symmetrical, tied by someone who'd done it 1,000 times, done by a soldier. Jacob's heart quickened. Using his box cutter, he sliced along the seam. Inside was a wooden lockbox, pale from age and slightly warped. A small brass latch held it shut. Jacob hesitated. Emily leaned forward. "What is it, Grandpa?" "Something someone cared about," he murmured. Kota moved closer, his nose brushing the box, as if urging Jacob to continue. Jacob opened it. The lid creaked. Inside was a photograph, black and white, protected in a plastic sleeve. A young soldier stared back at him with the determined eyes of a man who had seen both devastation and duty. The uniform bore the insignia of a high-ranking officer. Below the photo, a typed label read, "General Mason Ward." Jacob recognized the name. Mason Ward was a decorated commander who had led humanitarian and stabilization efforts across the Middle East 20 years earlier. He had been respected, beloved even, and then, mysteriously, had vanished from public life before his death. Jacob looked at the photo, then at the ruin of the unit, then at the duffel. "Why was this here?" he whispered. Kota rested his chin on Jacob's knee, his eyes steady, warm, grounding. As Jacob looked into that steady canine gaze, one truth settled deep and undeniable. This storage unit was not abandoned, it was hidden, and now it was theirs to uncover. The air inside Unit B-27 grew colder as the morning drizzle shifted into a heavier, steadier rain, tapping against the metal roof like distant footsteps. Jacob adjusted the collar of his coat, set Emily on her tarp nest, and knelt beside the growing pile of items he had unearthed from the military duffel. Coda settled beside Emily, his ears perked, his presence steady but alert, as if he understood that they had crossed from junk into something sacred. Jacob lifted the first box, a flattened trunk whose hinges creaked with the fatigue of decades. Inside lay a pristine dress uniform, deep navy with polished silver buttons, each aligned with meticulous precision. The 4 silver stars on the epaulets gleamed faintly despite the dim light. Jacob traced his fingers across the fabric. Only someone with discipline, pride, and a lifetime of service could have kept a uniform this immaculate. A voice echoed behind him. That belonged to a real soldier. Jacob turned to see a man lingering by the doorway, older, stooped slightly, wearing a neon orange safety vest. The man's name tag read, Mark Ellery, Maintenance. Mark was in his early 60s, his beard trimmed but graying unevenly, his face sun-weathered like someone who had spent more life outside than in. His eyes held a weight that only men who had lost something carried, families, wars, or time. "Sorry," Mark said, clearing his throat. "Didn't mean to intrude. Linda said someone actually bought this unit. Figured I'd check for mold leaks." Jacob nodded, noticing the faint tremor in Mark's left hand, the kind you saw in men who'd worked too much and slept too little. "You knew General Ward?" Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "Heard of him. My brother served under him in Basra. Said he had a spine made of steel and a heart made of gold. Didn't deserve the trouble his kids gave him." Before Jacob could ask more, Emily tugged at his sleeve, pointing toward a second battered box. Inside was a stack of albums wrapped in wax paper. When Jacob peeled the paper back, the scent of old leather and fading time floated out. He flipped open the first album. Black and white photographs of a young Mason Ward filled the pages, smiling with other soldiers, standing beside worn tents in desert heat, holding up letters from home. Another album held color photos from the 70s and 80s. Mason beside his wife, a striking woman with long auburn hair and warm hazel eyes. Mason holding 2 children, Alan and Lydia, both toddlers with curly hair and matching dimples. Life frozen, preserved, then forgotten in a dark storage room. Jacob swallowed. Why would any family let this rot here? Mark hesitated, then sighed heavily. Alan and Lydia. They were known around town. Alan's a lawyer, slick type. Lydia married rich and never stopped reminding people about it. I never met them, but folks said neither cared much for their dad after their mother passed. Something broke in. The family. Jacob felt a pang in his chest. He had known the fracture of family too, the way loss could rip through a home and turn memories into knives. As he reached into another crate, Coda suddenly stood, ears snapping upward. The dog's nose twitched and he pressed closer, his tail stiffening. "What is it, boy?" Jacob whispered. Coda nudged the side of the crate insistently. Jacob brushed away a layer of dust, revealing a fabric-wrapped bundle tied with military cord. When he untied it, a collection of medals spilled gently into his hands. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star, ribbons from campaigns stretching decades long. They glimmered even in the weak light, each one a chapter of sacrifice. Emily leaned closer, whispering, "They look like treasure." Jacob nodded. "In a way, they are." Coda lay down, resting his head on Emily's lap, but his eyes stayed fixed on Jacob's movements with almost human awareness. Every time Jacob lifted an object of significance, Coda's ears dipped forward as if he knew they were touching pieces of someone's truth. At the bottom of the crate, beneath an old rain poncho and a stack of field maps, Jacob found something small but heavy, a cassette recorder scratched and dented. Beside it, a neat row of microcassettes, each labeled with dates. Mark stepped closer. "Those look like personal logs." Jacob clicked the recorder open. It still held a tape. He rewound it, pressed play. Static buzzed, then a weary voice spilled out, fragile but firm. "This is Mason Ward. If these tapes are heard, then I no longer have control of my estate. My children, Alan and Lydia, They plan to declare me mentally unfit. They think my life's work is an asset to be liquidated." Jacob froze. Emily looked up, sensing the tension. Coda rose, moving to Jacob's side, letting his body lean gently against his leg. The voice continued. "I have hidden what matters, my medals, my files, my wife's keepsakes. I pray the person who finds this will understand what my own blood has forgotten. A man's life is more than dollar signs." The tape ended abruptly. Mark swallowed hard. That's not something he'd lie about. Jacob lowered his gaze to the medals in his lap, the albums carefully arranged by a man who had spent a lifetime serving everyone but himself. Emily leaned against him, her small voice soft. "Grandpa, we have to help him, don't we?" Jacob looked at Coda. The dog held his gaze, steady, unwavering, like a soldier waiting for orders. And in that silent exchange, Jacob felt the message clear as sunrise. These keepsakes weren't trash. They were a man's legacy. And now they rested in the hands of someone who knew the worth of sacrifice. He closed the box gently. The rain outside intensified, and Jacob Miller made a quiet promise, one born not from desperation, but from honor. The storm over Queen Anne Hill rolled in earlier than forecast, turning the narrow streets into silver rivers of runoff. Sheets of cold Seattle rain slapped against the windows of Jacob's small rental house, rattling the loose frame of the porch door. Inside, Jacob was sorting the last of Mason Ward's belongings. Albums stacked neatly, medals wrapped in cloth, and the recorder resting beside them, when Coda suddenly lifted his head. His ears shot forward, his muscles tightening beneath his sable and black coat. Moments later, headlights cut across the drenched street, and a sleek black Cadillac eased to a stop directly in front of Jacob's home. Jacob set the box down slowly. Only wealthy, powerful people drove a Cadillac that polished. A man climbed out, tall, impeccably groomed, wearing a charcoal gray tailored suit that screamed old money and entitlement. His posture was sharp, back straight, chin high, movements clipped with impatience. The moment he stepped into the rain, he shielded his hair with his leather briefcase, revealing a face carved with hard angles, a blade-like jawline, and cold gray eyes that never looked uncertain. This was Alan Ward, and he walked like the world owed him quiet roads and open doors. Alan slammed the car door, his expensive shoes splashing through the puddles without hesitation, and strode up the path. Under the porch light, his expression clenched into one of disdain, like he was approaching a place beneath him. Grief had once softened him, perhaps years back when his mother died, but privilege calcified him. Now he seemed like a man who solved problems with money, lawyers, or fear. Jacob barely had time to reach the front room when the old wooden door burst open. "You!" Alan barked, his voice slicing through the house like a thrown knife. "You thief! You took my father's property. Everything in that storage unit belongs to the Ward estate. Hand it over now." Emily, who had been coloring near the sofa, froze. The crayon snapped in her small hand. Her eyes widened with fear, and seconds later she let out a trembling cry. That sound, raw and frightened, cut straight through the tension. It also awakened something else. Coda surged forward, nails scraping the old floorboards, but his movement was controlled, deliberate. He planted himself solidly between Jacob and Alan, shoulders squared, ears forward, tail stiffened behind him like a spear. His gaze locked onto Alan's throat, unwavering. A low, deep growl rolled from his chest, a sound with the weight of old instinct and earned loyalty. Coda didn't bark. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to redraw the room's balance of power. Alan stumbled back a step, shock flickering across his face. "Call off your dog," he hissed, though his voice cracked in the middle, betraying a thread of panic. "I'm warning you. He's not the one you should worry about," Jacob said, voice steady, calm in a way that came only from years of hardship. "You don't get to storm into my house and terrify a child." Alan scoffed, though he didn't try stepping forward again. "Your house?" His lip curled. "This dump barely qualifies as a shelter." "You didn't come here to insult me," Jacob replied. "Say what you want." "I want what's mine," Alan shot back. "My father's belongings, every medal, every box, every tape. You're going to give it all back, or I'll have the police here in 5 minutes. Theft is still a crime in Washington." At that last sentence, Jacob reached for the cassette recorder on the table. He pressed play. Static crackled through the humid air. Then Mason Ward's frail but unwavering voice filled the room. "Alan is trying to take control of my estate. Says I'm confused. Nothing but inventory to him." Emily stopped crying. Alan's face drained of color. The rain outside seemed to quiet for a moment, as though the world held its breath. Jacob let the tape continue another sentence, then shut it off. "He trusted no one," Jacob said softly, "but he feared you." Alan didn't speak. The storm of arrogance collapsed from his face, replaced by calculation, then something darker, recognition. Jacob saw the moment Alan understood. These tapes could ruin him, destroy his career, shatter the polished Ward reputation. When Alan finally looked up, his voice had changed. "What do you want?" he asked, each word clipped and controlled. "Let's talk." Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he waited. Alan stepped closer, but still out of Coda's range, and opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a checkbook, gold pen glinting under the dim light. His shoulders straightened, returning to the only language he'd ever mastered, leverage. $100,000, Alan said, writing with swift precision. "Cashier's check, today." He tore the check, slid it toward Jacob on the wobbly table. "In exchange," Alan continued, "you hand over every object, and you remain silent, forever. Plus," he paused, looking at Emily, "I'll establish a fully funded private scholarship trust for your granddaughter, her entire education covered." Jacob felt the weight of the room shift. Emily, still trembling, leaned into his leg. Coda stayed firm, but his ears flicked back as if sensing the change. Jacob took a slow breath. His duty as a Marine warred with his duty as a grandfather, but family won. "I accept," Jacob said at last. Alan allowed himself a relieved exhale, but then Jacob lifted a worn canvas bag and placed a stack of bundled bills on the table. $37,000 from the storage unit. "This is your father's too," Jacob said. "I borrowed 1,600 of it to keep this house. The rest, it goes back." Alan stared at the money, stunned. For once, the arrogant lawyer had no words, no argument, nothing but the realization that he was standing before a kind of man he had never been, a man of honor. The drizzle eased into a soft, silvery veil over Seattle, drifting across rooftops like a tired breath. The city felt gentler now, as if the storm that had raged through Jacob's life had finally run its course. Inside the small rental house on Queen Anne Hill, the air was warmer, filled not with tension but the faint aroma of oatmeal and the lingering scent of wet dog from Coda's morning patrol around the yard. Jacob stood near the kitchen sink, turning the small porcelain music box over in his hands. The ballerina inside had lost her spin months ago. The mechanism snapped in the chaos of poverty, eviction notices, and desperate choices. But the box meant everything to Emily, one of the last things her mother had given her before life unraveled. It held a history no storage unit could match. That morning, Jacob made a choice. He wrapped the music box in a checkered kitchen towel, tucked it under his coat, and told Emily they were going on a small adventure. Coda, sensing purpose, trotted immediately to the door, tail raised, eyes bright. His movements had regained something youthful lately, as if the storms of the past weeks had sharpened his instincts and deepened his bond with the small family he guarded. The walk down the hill toward Pike Place Market was slow and steady. The vendors were just setting up, fishermen unloading the first crates of salmon, bakers arranging cinnamon rolls behind foggy glass, flower stalls blooming even in the cold. The rain polished the cobblestones, turning them into mirrors reflecting red neon signs and passing umbrellas. At the corner, tucked between a pottery shop and a tiny cafe, stood Petrov's Clock and Repair, its window filled with ancient clocks, brass gears, and trinkets that seemed to whisper stories from decades past. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of oil, cedar, and old machinery. Behind the counter stood Mikhail Petrov, a thin man in his late 60s with snow-white hair combed neatly back and a mustache as sharp as a painter's brush. His pale skin bore the creases of a man who had lived through hardship, rumored to have escaped political turmoil in Eastern Europe years ago. His hands, though aged, were steady and delicate. Mikhail rarely smiled, but when he did, it reached his light blue eyes with surprising gentleness. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," he greeted softly, his accent thick and melodic. "You bring me something fragile today?" Jacob unwrapped the music box, revealing its chipped edges. "It belonged to my granddaughter's mother. She loves it. I want her to hear it again." Emily peeked from behind Jacob's leg. Mikhail's stern demeanor softened. Koda sat nearby, posture polite but vigilant, as if taking quiet inventory of every ticking clock in the shop. Mikhail examined the music box with reverence, as though he understood the weight of its story. Spring mechanism broken, but not lost. He glanced at Emily. "You want the ballerina to dance again, da?" Emily nodded, gripping Koda's ear gently for courage. "It will take one day," Mikhail said, "but I will fix it." Jacob reached into his pocket and handed him 2 crisp $20 bills, money he had earned, honestly, through selling restored items from the storage unit. Mikhail accepted it with a nod, though his expression softened again as he watched Emily smile shyly. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Music will wait for you." As they walked home through the mist, Koda brushed close to Emily's side, nudging her occasionally as if reminding her to stay warm. Every so often he paused, scanning the street with that soldier-like caution he had carried since the day Jacob rescued him. When a delivery man accidentally dropped a metal crate nearby, the loud clang made Emily jump. Koda instantly stepped between her and the noise, calm but ready, an instinctive shield against anything threatening. The next afternoon, the drizzle had lifted into a glowing amber afternoon. They returned to Petrov's shop, and Mikhail greeted them with the music box held gently in both hands. "It sings again," he said simply. Emily took it carefully. Jacob helped her wind the small silver key. For a breathless moment, only silence. Then a clear, delicate melody rose, soft, crystalline notes filling the shop like tiny lanterns drifting upward. The ballerina turned smoothly, her pale blue dress shimmering under the warm lights. Emily gasped. Her smile burst open, bright and pure, the kind that lived beyond hardship. Koda lifted his head, ears perked, as if listening to every note. He moved closer and rested his chin on Emily's knee, eyes soft, tail sweeping once across the floor. The music filled not just the room, but something inside Jacob that had long been hollow. Walking home, Jacob realized what had been growing inside him since the day he opened that storage unit. He had spent years drowning in failure, convincing himself he was nothing more than a broken veteran with too many regrets. But he had protected a legacy that wasn't his, returned money he could have taken, and chosen honor over comfort. And Emily, bright, resilient, whole despite the world's attempts to dim her, was looking at him with trust deeper than blood. Koda brushed against his leg again, warm and solid, loyal not because of duty, but because he chose them. By the time they reached the crest of the Queen Anne Hill, the sky had broken open into streaks of gold. The Puget Sound below shimmered like a promise. The house was still old, still small, still creaking in the wind, but it was home now, a place rebuilt not by money, but by courage, loyalty, and love. And as the last notes of the ballerina's song faded inside the kitchen that night, Jacob understood fully. Family isn't something you're given. It's something you earn, protect, and grow into. And sometimes it chooses you first. In the quiet after the storm, Jacob came to understand something he had spent years trying to outrun. Miracles don't always arrive in flashes of lightning or the roar of angels. Sometimes they walk on four paws, sit beside a frightened child, or whisper courage into a tired man's heart. Koda was no prophet, no saint, just a loyal German shepherd with a steady gaze and a heart that refused to abandon the family he chose. But through him, Jacob saw the unmistakable fingerprints of God, guidance in moments of fear, protection in moments of danger, and warmth in the coldest corners of a man's life. And maybe that is how the Lord works in our world, not always through grand signs, but through everyday graces, a stranger offering help, a child's laughter after a long silence, a loyal friend who stands firm when everyone else walks away. In our daily struggles, bills we fear we can't pay, loneliness that sits heavy at night, or the quiet ache of trying to be strong for those we love, there are still threads of divine light woven into the ordinary. We only have to look closely and hold on to hope. If this story touched your heart, if you believe miracles still rise in the small corners of life, we invite you to share your thoughts below. Tell us where you're watching from and what blessings have found you when you needed them most. Please like, comment, and subscribe to help these stories of faith, loyalty, and redemption reach more people who might need them. And may God's grace rest upon you today. May He guide your steps, warm your home, and place a loyal guardian by your side just when you need one most. God bless you and your family.